Ivanhoe, by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 8. At this the challenger with fierce defy his trumpet sounds, the challenged makes reply. With clangour rings the field, resounds the vaulted sky, their visors closed, their lances in rest, or at the helmet pointed or the crest. They vanish from the barrier, speed the race, and spurring see decrease the middle space. Palamon and Arcite. In the midst of Prince John's cavalcade he suddenly stopped, and, appealing to the Prior of Jorvaulx, declared the principal business of the day had been forgotten. "By my halidom," said he, "we have neglected, Sir Prior, to name the fair sovereign of love and of beauty, by whose white hand the palm is to be distributed. For my part, I am liberal in my ideas, and I care not if I give my vote for the black-eyed Rebecca." "Holy Virgin!" answered the Prior, turning up his eyes in horror, "a Jewess? We should deserve to be stoned out of the lists, and I am not yet old enough to be a martyr. Besides, I swear by my patron saint that she is far inferior to the lovely Saxon, Rowena." "Saxon or Jew," answered the Prince, "Saxon or Jew, dog or hog, what matters it? I say, name Rebecca, were it only to mortify the Saxon churls." A murmur arose even among his own immediate attendants. "This passes a jest, my lord," said De Bracy. "No knight here will lay lance in rest if such an insult is attempted." "It is the mere wantonness of an insult," said one of the oldest and most important of Prince John's followers, Waldemar Fitzurse; "and if your grace attempt it, cannot but prove ruinous to your projects." "I entertain you, sir," said John, reining up his palfrey haughtily, "for my follower, but not for my counsellor." "Those who follow your grace in the paths which you tread," said Waldemar, but speaking in a low voice, "acquire the right of counsellors, for your interest and safety are not more deeply gauged than their own." From the tone in which this was spoken, John saw the necessity of acquiescence. "I did but jest," he said, "and you turn upon me like so many adders. Name who you will, in the fiend's name, and please yourselves." "Nay, nay," said De Bracy, "let the fair sovereign's throne remain unoccupied until the conqueror shall be named, and then let him choose the lady by whom it shall be filled. It will add another grace to his triumph, and teach fair ladies to prize the love of valiant knights who can exalt them to such distinction." "If Brian de Bois Guilbert gain the prize," said the Prior, "I will gage my rosary that I name the sovereign of love and beauty." "Bois Guilbert," answered De Bracy, "is a good lance, but there are others around these lists, Sir Prior, who will not fear to encounter him." "Silence, sirs," said Waldemar, "and let the Prince assume his seat. The knights and spectators are alike impatient, the time advances, and highly fit it is that the sports should commence." Prince John, though not yet a monarch, had in Waldemar Fitzurse all the inconveniences of a favourite minister, who, in serving his sovereign, must always do so in his own way. The Prince acquiesced, however, although his disposition was precisely of that kind which is apt to be obstinate upon trifles, and assuming his throne, and being surrounded by his followers, gave signal to the heralds to proclaim the laws of the tournament, which were briefly as follows. First, the 5 challengers were to undertake all comers. Secondly, any knight proposing to combat might, if he pleased, select a special antagonist from among the challengers by touching his shield. If he did so with the reverse of his lance, the trial of skill was made with what were called the arms of courtesy, that is, with lances at whose extremity a piece of round flat board was fixed, so that no danger was encountered save from the shock of the horses and riders. But if the shield was touched with the sharp end of the lance, the combat was understood to be at outrance, That is, the knights were to fight with sharp weapons, as in actual battle. Thirdly, when the knights present had accomplished their vow, by each of them breaking 5 lances, the Prince was to declare the victor in the first day's tourney, who should receive as prize a war-horse of exquisite beauty and matchless strength. And in addition to this reward of valour, it was now declared he should have the peculiar honour of naming the Queen of Love and Beauty, by whom the prize should be given on the ensuing day. Fourthly, it was announced that on the second day there should be a general tournament, in which all the knights present, who were desirous to win praise, might take part, and being divided into 2 bands of equal numbers, might fight it out manfully, until the signal was given by Prince John to cease the combat. The elected Queen of Love and Beauty was then to crown the knight, whom the Prince should adjudge to have borne himself best in this second day, with a coronet composed of thin gold plate, cut into the shape of a laurel crown. On this second day the knightly games ceased, but on that which was to follow, feats of archery, of bull-baiting, and other popular amusements were to be practised, for the more immediate amusement of the populace. In this manner did Prince John endeavour to lay the foundation of a popularity which he was perpetually throwing down by some inconsiderate act of wanton aggression upon the feelings and prejudices of the people. The lists now presented a most splendid spectacle. The sloping galleries were crowded with all that was noble, great, wealthy, and beautiful in the northern and midland parts of England, and the contrast of the various dresses of these dignified spectators rendered the view as gay as it was rich, while the interior and lower space, filled with the substantial burgesses and yeomen of merry England, formed, in their more plain attire, a dark fringe or border around this circle of brilliant embroidery, relieving and at the same time setting off its splendour. The heralds finished their proclamation with their usual cry of "Largesse, largesse, gallant knights!" and gold and silver pieces were showered on them from the galleries, it being a high point of chivalry to exhibit liberality towards those whom the age accounted at once the secretaries and the historians of honour. The bounty of the spectators was acknowledged by the customary shouts of "Love of ladies! Death of champions! Honour to the generous! Glory to the brave!" to which the more humble spectators added their acclamations, and a numerous band of trumpeters the flourish of their martial instruments. When these sounds had ceased, the heralds withdrew from the lists in gay and glittering procession, and none remained within them save the marshals of the field, who, armed cap a pie, sat on horseback, motionless as statues, at the opposite ends of the lists. Meantime, the enclosed space at the northern extremity of the lists, large as it was now completely crowded with knights desirous to prove their skill against the challengers, and, when viewed from the galleries, presented the appearance of a sea of waving plumage, intermixed with glistening helmets and tall lances, to the extremities of which were, in many cases, attached small pennons about a span's breadth, which, fluttering in the air as the breeze caught them, joined with the restless motion of the feathers to add liveliness to the scene. At length the barriers were opened, and 5 knights, chosen by lot, advanced slowly into the area, a single champion riding in front, and the other 4 following in pairs. All were splendidly armed, and my Saxon authority, in the Wardour manuscript, records at greater length their devices, their colours, and the embroidery of their horse trappings. It is unnecessary to be particular on these subjects, to borrow lines from a contemporary poet, who has written but too little. The knights are dust, and their good swords are rust. Their souls are with the saints, we trust. Their escutcheons have long mouldered from the walls of their castles. Their castles themselves are but green mounds and shattered ruins. The place that once knew them knows them no more. Nay, Many a race since theirs has died out and been forgotten in the very land they occupied with all the authority of feudal proprietors and feudal lords. What then would it avail the reader to know their names, or the evanescent symbols of their martial rank? Now, however, no whit anticipating the oblivion which awaited their names and feats, the champions advanced through the lists, restraining their fiery steeds, and compelling them to move slowly, while at the same time they exhibited their paces, together with the grace and dexterity of the riders. As the procession entered the lists, the sound of a wild barbaric music was heard from behind the tents of the challengers, where the performers were concealed. It was of Eastern origin, having been brought from the Holy Land, and the mixture of the cymbals and bells seemed to bid welcome at once, and defiance, to the knights as they advanced. With the eyes of an immense concourse of spectators fixed upon them, the 5 knights advanced up the platform upon which the tents of the challengers stood, and there, separating themselves, each touched slightly with the reverse of his lance the shield of the antagonist to whom he wished to oppose himself. The lower order of spectators in general, nay, many of the higher class, and it is even said several of the ladies, were rather disappointed at the champions choosing the arms of courtesy. For the same sort of persons who, in the present day, applaud most highly the deepest tragedies, were then interested in a tournament exactly in proportion to the danger incurred by the champions engaged. Having intimated their more pacific purpose, the champions retreated to the extremity of the lists, where they remained drawn up in a line, while the challengers, sallying each from his pavilion, mounted their horses and, headed by Brian de Bois Guilbert, descended from the platform, and opposed themselves individually to the knights who had touched their respective shields. At the flourish of clarions and trumpets, they started out against each other at full gallop, and such was the superior dexterity or good fortune of the challengers, that those opposed to Bois Guilbert, Malvoisin, and Front-Bœuf rolled on the ground. The antagonist of Grandmesnil, instead of bearing his lance point far against the crest or the shield of his enemy, swerved so much from the direct line as to break the weapon athwart the person of his opponent, a circumstance which was accounted more disgraceful than that of actually being unhorsed, because the latter might happen from accident, whereas the former evinced awkwardness and want of management of the weapon and of the horse. The 5th knight alone maintained the honour of his party, and parted fairly with the Knight of St. John, both splintering their lances without advantage on either side. The shouts of the multitude, together with the acclamations of the heralds, and the clangor of the trumpets, announced the triumph of the victors, and the defeat of the vanquished. The former retreated to their pavilions, and the latter, gathering themselves up as they could, withdrew from the lists in disgrace and dejection, to agree with their victors concerning the redemption of their arms and their horses, which, according to the laws of the tournament, they had forfeited. The 5th of their number alone tarried in the lists long enough to be greeted by the applauses of the spectators, amongst whom he retreated to the aggravation, doubtless, of his companion's mortification. A 2nd and a 3rd party of knights took the field, and although they had various success, yet, upon the whole, the advantage decidedly remained with the challengers, not one of whom lost his seat or swerved from his charge, misfortunes which befell 1 or 2 of their antagonists in each encounter. The spirits, therefore, of those opposed to them seemed to be considerably damped by their continued success. 3 knights only appeared on the 4th entry, who, avoiding the shields of Bois Guilbert and Front-Bœuf, contented themselves with touching those of the 3 other knights who had not altogether manifested the same strength and dexterity. This politic selection did not alter the fortune of the field. The challengers were still successful. One of their antagonists was overthrown, and both the others failed in the attempt, that is, in striking the helmet and shield of their antagonist firmly and strongly, with the lance held in a direct line, so that the weapon might break unless the champion was overthrown. Begin note about attaint. This term of chivalry transferred to the law gives the phrase of being attainted of treason. End note. After this fourth encounter, there was a considerable pause, nor did it appear that anyone was very desirous of renewing the contest. The spectators murmured among themselves, for among the challengers, Malvoisin and Front de Bœuf were unpopular from their characters, and the others, except Grantmesnil, were disliked as strangers and foreigners. But none shared the general feeling of dissatisfaction so keenly as Cedric the Saxon, who saw in each advantage gained by the Norman challengers a repeated triumph over the honour of England. His own education had taught him no skill in the games of chivalry, although with the arms of his Saxon ancestors he had manifested himself on many occasions a brave and determined soldier. He looked anxiously to Athelstane, who had learned the accomplishments of the age, as if desiring that he should make some personal effort to recover the victory which was passing into the hands of the Templar and his associates. But though both stout of heart and strong of person, Athelstane had a disposition too inert and unambitious to make the exertions which Cedric seemed to expect from him. "The day is against England, my lord," said Cedric in a marked tone. "Are you not tempted to take the lance?" "I shall tilt tomorrow," answered Athelstane, "in the melee. It is not worth while for me to arm myself today." Two things displeased Cedric in this speech. It contained the Norman word melee, to express the general conflict, and it evinced some indifference to the honour of the country. But it was spoken by Athelstane, whom he held in such profound respect that he would not trust himself to canvass his motives or his foibles. Moreover, he had no time to make any remark, for Wamba thrust in his sword, observing, "It was better, though scarce easier, to be the best man among 100 than the best man of 2. Athelstane took the observation as a serious compliment, but Cedric, who better understood the jester's meaning, darted him a severe and menacing look, and it was lucky for Wamba, perhaps, that the time and place prevented his receiving, notwithstanding his place and service, more sensible marks of his master's resentment. The pause in the tournament was still uninterrupted, excepting by the voices of the heralds exclaiming, "Love of ladies, splintering of lances, stand forth, gallant knights, fair eyes look upon your deeds." The music also of the challengers breathed from time to time wild bursts expressive of triumph or defiance, while the clowns grudged a holiday which seemed to pass away in inactivity, and old knights and nobles lamented in whispers the decay of martial spirit, spoke of the triumphs of their younger days, but agreed that the land did not now supply dames of such transcendent beauty as had animated the jousts of former times. Prince John began to talk to his attendants about making ready the banquet, and the necessity of adjudging the prize to Brian de Bois Guilbert, who had, with a single spear, overthrown 2 knights, and foiled a third. At length, as the Saracenic music of the challengers concluded, one of those long and high flourishes with which they had broken the silence of the lists, it was answered by a solitary trumpet, which breathed a note of defiance from the northern extremity. All eyes were turned to see the new champion, which these sounds announced, and no sooner were the barriers opened than he paced into the lists. As far as could be judged of a man sheathed in armour, the new adventurer did not greatly exceed the middle size, and seemed to be rather slender than strongly made. His suit of armour was formed of steel, richly inlaid with gold, and the device on his shield was a young oak tree pulled up by the roots, with the Spanish word desticado, signifying disinherited. He was mounted on a gallant black horse, and as he passed through the lists, he gracefully saluted the prince and the ladies by lowering his lance. The dexterity with which he managed his steed, and something of a youthful grace which he displayed in his manner, won him the favour of the multitude, which some of the lower classes expressed by calling out, "Touch Ralph de Vipon's shield! Touch the Hospitaler's shield! He has the least sure seat, he is your cheapest bargain." The champion, moving onward amid these well-meant hints, ascended the platform by the sloping alley which led to it from the lists, and to the astonishment of all present, riding straight up to the central pavilion, struck with the sharp end of his spear the shield of Brian de Bois Guilbert until it rang again. All stood astonished at his presumption, but none more than the redoubted knight whom he had thus defied to mortal combat, and who, little expecting so rude a challenge, was standing carelessly at the door of the pavilion. "Have you confessed yourself, brother?" said the Templar, "and have you heard mass this morning, that you peril your life so frankly?" "I am fitter to meet death than thou art," answered the Disinherited Knight, for by this name the stranger had recorded himself in the books of the tourney. "Then take your place in the lists," said Bois Guilbert, "and look your last upon the sun, for this night thou shalt sleep in paradise." "Gramercy for thy courtesy," replied the Disinherited Knight, "and to requite it, I advise thee to take a fresh horse and a new lance, for by my honour you will need both." Having expressed himself thus confidently, he reined his horse backward down the slope which he had ascended, and compelled him in the same manner to move backward through the lists, till he reached the northern extremity, where he remained stationary in expectation of his antagonist. This feat of horsemanship again attracted the applause of the multitude. However incensed at his adversary for the precautions which he recommended, Brian de Bois Guilbert did not neglect his advice, for his honour was too nearly concerned to permit his neglecting any means which might ensure victory over his presumptuous opponent. He changed his horse for a proved and fresh one of great strength and spirit. He chose a new and tough spear, lest the wood of the former might have been strained in the previous encounters he had sustained. Lastly, he laid aside his shield, which had received some little damage, and received another from his squires. His first had only borne the general device of his rider, representing two knights riding upon one horse, an emblem expressive of the original humility and poverty of the Templars, qualities which they had since exchanged for the arrogance and wealth that finally occasioned their suppression. Bois Guilbert's new shield bore a raven in full flight, holding in its claws a skull, and bearing the motto, Gare le Corbeau. When the two champions stood opposed to each other at the two extremities of the lists, the public expectation was strained to the highest pitch. Few augured the possibility that the encounter could terminate well for the Disinherited Knight, yet his courage and gallantry secured the general good wishes of the spectators. Trumpets had no sooner given the signal than the champions vanished from their posts with the speed of lightning, and closed in the centre of the list with the shock of a thunderbolt. The lances burst into shivers up to the very grasp, and it seemed at the moment that both knights had fallen, for the shock had made each horse recoil backward upon its haunches. The address of the riders recovered their steeds by use of the bridle and spur, and having glared on each other for an instant, with eyes which seemed to flash fire through the bars of their visors, each made a demi-volte, and retiring to the extremity of the lists, received a fresh lance from the attendants. A loud shout from the spectators, waving of scarves and handkerchiefs, and general acclamations attested the interest taken by the spectators in this encounter, and most equal as well as the best performed which had graced the day. But no sooner had the knights resumed their station than the clamour of applause was hushed into a silence so deep and so dead that it seemed the multitude were afraid even to breathe. A few minutes' pause having been allowed, that the combatants and their horses might recover breath, Prince John with his truncheon signed to the trumpets to sound the onset. The champions a second time sprung from their stations, and closed in the centre of the lists with the same speed, the same dexterity, The same violence, but not the same equal fortune as before. In this second encounter, the Templar aimed at the centre of his antagonist's shield, and struck it so far and forcibly that his spear went to shivers, and the Disinherited Knight reeled in his saddle. On the other hand, that champion had, in the beginning of his career, directed the point of his lance toward Bois Guilbert's shield, but, changing his aim almost in the moment of encounter, he addressed it to the helmet, a mark more difficult to hit, but which, if attained, rendered the shock more irresistible. Fair and true, he hit the Norman on the visor, where his lance's point kept hold of the bars. Yet even at this disadvantage, the Templar sustained his high reputation, and had not the girths of his saddle burst, he might not have been unhorsed. As it chanced, however, saddle, horse, and man rolled on the ground under a cloud of dust. To extricate himself from the stirrups and fallen steed was to the Templar scarce the work of a moment, and stung with madness, both at his disgrace and at the acclamations with which it was hailed by the spectators, he drew his sword and waved it in defiance of his conqueror. The Disinherited Knight sprung from his steed, and also unsheathed his sword. The marshals of the field, however, spurred their horses between them, and reminded them that the laws of the tournament did not, on the present occasion, permit this species of encounter. "We shall meet again, I trust," said the Templar, casting a resentful glance at his antagonist, "and where there are none to separate us." "If we do not," said the Disinherited Knight, "the fault shall not be mine. On foot or horseback, with spear, with axe, or with sword, I am alike ready to encounter thee." More and angrier words would have been exchanged, but the marshals, crossing their lances betwixt them, compelled them to separate. The Disinherited Knight returned to his first station, and Bois Guilbert to his tent, where he remained for the rest of the day in an agony of despair. Without alighting from his horse, the conqueror called for a bowl of wine, and opening the beaver, or lower part of his helmet, announced that he quaffed it. "To all true English hearts, and to the confusion of foreign tyrants." He then commanded his trumpet to sound a defiance to the challengers, and desired a herald to announce to them that he should make no election, but was willing to encounter them in the order in which they pleased to advance against him. The gigantic Front de Bœuf, armed in sable armour, was the first who took the field. He bore on a white shield a black bull's head, half defaced by the numerous encounters which he had undergone, and bearing the arrogant motto, Cave Adsum. Over this champion the Disinherited Knight obtained a slight but decisive advantage. Both knights broke their lances fairly, but Front de Bœuf, who lost a stirrup in the encounter, was adjudged to have the disadvantage. In the stranger's third encounter with Sir Philip Malvoisin, he was equally successful, striking that baron so forcibly on the casque that the laces of the helmet broke, and Malvoisin, only saved from falling by being unhelmeted, was declared vanquished like his companions. In his fourth combat with the Grand Mesnil, the Disinherited Knight showed as much courtesy as he had hitherto evinced courage and dexterity. The Grand Mesnil's horse, which was young and violent, reared and plunged in the course of the career, so as to disturb the rider's aim, and the stranger, declining to take the advantage which this accident afforded him, raised his lance, and passing his antagonist without touching him, wheeled his horse and rode back again to his own end of the lists, offering his antagonist, by a herald, the chance of a second encounter. This the Grand Mesnil declined, avowing himself vanquished as much by the courtesy as by the address of his opponent. Ralph de Vipont summoned up the lists of the stranger's triumphs, being hurled to the ground with such force that the blood gushed from his nose and his mouth, and he was borne senseless from the lists. The acclamations of thousands applauded the unanimous award of the Prince and Marshals, announcing that day's honours to the Disinherited Knight. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. In the midst was seen a lady of more majestic mien, by stature and by beauty marked their sovereign queen. And as in beauty she surpassed the choir, so nobler than the rest was her attire. A crown of ruddy gold enclosed her brow, plain without pomp, and rich without a show. A branch of Agnes Castus in her hand, she bore aloft her symbol of command, the flower and the leaf. William de Weevil and Stephen de Martival, the marshals of the field, were the first to offer their congratulations to the victor, praying him at the same time to suffer his helmet to be unlaced, or at least that he would raise his visor ere they conducted him to receive the prize of the day's tourney from the hands of Prince John. The Disinherited Knight, with all knightly courtesy, declined their request, alleging that he could not at this time suffer his face to be seen, for reasons which he had assigned to the heralds when he entered the lists. The marshals were perfectly satisfied by this reply, for amidst the frequent and capricious vows by which knights were accustomed to bind themselves in the days of chivalry, there were none more common than those by which they engaged to remain incognito for a certain space, or until some particular adventure was achieved. The marshals, therefore, pressed no farther into the mystery of the Disinherited Knight, but, announcing to Prince John the conqueror's desire to remain unknown, they requested permission to bring him before his grace, in order that he might receive the reward of his valour. John's curiosity was excited by the mystery observed by the stranger, and being already displeased with the issue of the tournament, in which the challengers whom he favoured had been successively defeated by one knight, he answered haughtily to the marshals, "By the light of Our Lady's brow, this same knight hath been disinherited as well of his courtesy as of his lands, since he desires to appear before us without uncovering his face. Wot ye, my lords," he said, turning round to his train, "who this gallant can be that bears himself thus proudly?" "I cannot guess," answered de Bracy, "nor did I think that there had been within the four seas that girth Britain a champion that could bear down these 5 knights in one day's jousting. By my faith, I shall never forget the force with which he shocked Vipon. The poor Hospitaller was hurled from his saddle like a stone from a sling." "Boast not of that," said a knight of St. John who was present. "Your temple champion had no better luck. I saw your brave lance, Bois Guilbert, roll thrice over, grasping his hands full of sand at every turn." De Bracy, being attached to the Templars, would have replied, but was prevented by Prince John. "Silence, sirs," he said. "What unprofitable debate have we here?" "The victor," said de Weevil, "still waits the pleasure of your highness." "It is our pleasure," answered John, "that he do so wait until we learn whether there is not some one who can at least guess at his name and quality. Should he remain there till nightfall, he has had his work enough to keep him warm." "Your Grace," said Waldemar Fitzurse, "will do less than due honour to the victor, if you compel him to wait till we tell your highness that which we cannot know. At least I can form no guess, unless he be one of the good lances who accompanied King Richard to Palestine, and who are now straggling homeward from the Holy Land." "It may be the Earl of Salisbury," said de Bracy. "He is about the same pitch." "Sir Thomas de Multon, the Knight of Gisland, rather," said Fitzurse. "Salisbury is bigger in the bones." A whisper arose among the train, but by whom first suggested could not be ascertained. "It might be the king, it might be Richard Coeur de Lion himself." "Over God's forbode," said Prince John, involuntarily turning at the same time as pale as death, and shrinking as if blighted by a flash of lightning. "Waldemar, de Bracy, brave knights and gentlemen, remember your promises, and stand truly by me." "Here is no danger impending," said Waldemar Fitzurse. "Are you so little acquainted with the gigantic limbs of your father's son, as to think they can be held within the circumference of yonder suit of armour? De Weevil and Martival, You will best serve the Prince by bringing forward the victor to the throne, and ending an error that has conjured all the blood from his cheeks. Look at him more closely," he continued. "Your Highness will see that he wants 3 inches of King Richard's height, and twice as much of his shoulder breadth. The very horse he backs could not have carried the ponderous weight of King Richard through a single course." While he was yet speaking, the marshals brought forward the Disinherited Knight to the foot of a wooden flight of steps, which formed the ascent from the lists to Prince John's throne. Still discomposed with the idea that his brother, so much injured, and to whom he was so much indebted, had suddenly arrived in his native kingdom, even the distinctions pointed out by Fitzurse did not altogether remove the Prince's apprehensions. And while, with a short and embarrassed eulogy upon his valour, he caused to be delivered to him the war-horse assigned as the prize, he trembled lest from the barred visor of the mailed form before him an answer might be returned in the deep and awful accents of Richard the Lion-hearted. But the Disinherited Knight spoke not a word in reply to the compliment of the Prince, which he only acknowledged with a profound obeisance. The horse was led into the lists by 2 grooms richly dressed, the animal itself being fully accoutred with the richest war furniture, which, however, scarcely added to the value of the noble creature in the eyes of those who were judges. Laying one hand upon the pommel of the saddle, the Disinherited Knight vaulted at once upon the back of the steed without making use of the stirrup, and, brandishing aloft his lance, rode twice around the lists, exhibiting the points and paces of the horse with the skill of a perfect horseman. The appearance of vanity which might otherwise have been attributed to this display was removed by the propriety shown in exhibiting to the best advantage the princely reward with which he had been just honoured, and the knight was again greeted by the acclamations of all present. In the meanwhile, the bustling prior of Jorvaulx had reminded Prince John, in a whisper, that the victor must now display his good judgment, instead of his valour, by selecting from among the beauties who graced the galleries a lady who should fill the throne of the Queen of Beauty and of Love, and deliver the prize of the tourney upon the ensuing day. The Prince accordingly made a sign with his truncheon as the knight passed him in his second career around the lists. The knight turned towards the throne, and, sinking his lance until the point was within a foot of the ground, remained motionless, as if expecting John's commands, while all admired the sudden dexterity with which he instantly reduced his fiery steed from a state of violent emotion and high excitation to the stillness of an equestrian statue. "Sir Disinherited Knight," said Prince John, "since that is the only title by which we can address you, it is now your duty, as well as privilege, to name the fair lady who, as Queen of Honour and of Love, is to preside over next day's festival. If, as a stranger in our land, you should require the aid of other judgment to guide your own, we can only say that Alicia, the daughter of our gallant knight Waldemar Fitzurse, has at our court been long held the first in beauty as in place. Nevertheless, it is your undoubted prerogative to confer on whom you please this crown, by the delivery of which to the lady of your choice the election of tomorrow's queen will be formal and complete. Raise your lance." The knight obeyed, and Prince John placed upon its point a coronet of green satin, having around its edge a circlet of gold, the upper edge of which was relieved by arrow points and hearts placed interchangeably, like the strawberry leaves and balls upon a ducal crown. In the broad hint which he dropped respecting the daughter of Waldemar Fitzurse, John had more than one motive, each the offspring of a mind which was a strange mixture of carelessness and presumption with low artifice and cunning. He wished to banish from the minds of the chivalry around him his own indecent and unacceptable jest respecting the Jewess Rebecca. He was desirous of conciliating Alicia's father, Waldemar, of whom he stood in awe, and who had more than once shown himself dissatisfied during the course of the day's proceedings. He had also a wish to establish himself in the good graces of the lady, for John was at least as licentious in his pleasures as profligate in his ambition. But besides all these reasons, he was desirous to raise up against the Disinherited Knight, towards whom he already entertained a strong dislike, a powerful enemy in the person of Waldemar Fitzurse, who was likely, he thought, highly to resent the injury done to his daughter in case, as was not unlikely, the victor should make another choice. And so indeed it proved, for the Disinherited Knight passed the gallery close to that of the Prince, in which the Lady Alicia was seated in the full pride of triumphant beauty, and pacing forwards as slowly as he had hitherto rode swiftly around the lists, he seemed to exercise his right of examining the numerous fair faces which adorned that splendid circle. It was worth while to see the different conduct of the beauties who underwent this examination, during the time it was proceeding. Some blushed, some assumed an air of pride and dignity, some looked straight forward and essayed to seem utterly unconscious of what was going on. Some drew back in alarm, which was perhaps affected. Some endeavoured to forbear smiling, and there were 2 or 3 who laughed outright. There were also some who dropped their veils over their charms, but as the Wardour manuscript says, these were fair ones of 10 years' standing. It may be supposed that, having had their full share of such vanities, they were willing to withdraw their claim in order to give a fair chance to the rising beauties of the age. At length the champion paused beneath the balcony in which the Lady Rowena was placed, and the expectation of the spectators was excited to the utmost. It must be owned that, if an interest displayed in his success could have bribed the Disinherited Knight, the part of the lists before which he paused had merited his predilection. Cedric the Saxon, overjoyed at the discomfiture of the Templar, and still more so at the miscarriage of his 2 malevolent neighbours, Front de Bœuf and Malvoisin, had, with his body half stretched over the balcony, accompanied the victor in each course, not with his eyes only, but with his whole heart and soul. The Lady Rowena had watched the progress of the day with equal attention, though without openly betraying the same intense interest. Even the unmoved Athelstane had shown symptoms of shaking off his apathy, when calling for a huge goblet of muscadine, he quaffed it to the health of the Disinherited Knight. Another group, stationed under the gallery occupied by the Saxons, had shown no less interest in the fate of the day. "Father Abraham," said Isaac of York, when the first course was run betwixt the Templar and the Disinherited Knight, "how fiercely that gentile rides! Ah, the good horse that was brought all the long way from Barbary, he takes no more care of him than if he were a wild ass's colt. And the noble armour that was worth so many zecchins to Joseph Perea, the armour of Milan, besides 70 in the 100 of profits, he cares for it as little as if he had found it in the highways." "If he risks his own person and limbs, father," said Rebecca, "in doing such a dreadful battle, he can scarce be expected to spare his horse and armour." "Child," replied Isaac, somewhat heated, "thou knowest not what thou speakest. His neck and limbs are his own, but his horse and armour belong to— Holy Jacob! What was I about to say? Nevertheless, it is a good youth. See, Rebecca, see, he is again about to go up to battle against the Philistine. Pray, child, pray for the safety of the good youth, and of the speedy horse and the rich armour. God of my fathers," he again exclaimed, "he hath conquered, and the uncircumcised Philistine hath fallen before his lance, even as Og the king of Bashan and Sihon king of the Amorites fell before the sword of our fathers. Surely he shall take their gold and their silver, and their war horses, and their armour of brass and of steel, for a prey and for a spoil." The same anxiety did the worthy Jew display during every course that was run, seldom failing to hazard a hasty calculation concerning the value of the horse and armour which were forfeited to the champion upon each new success. There had been therefore no small interest taken in the success of the Disinherited Knight by those who occupied the part of the lists before which he now paused. Whether from indecision or some other motive of hesitation, the champion of the day remained stationary for more than a minute, while the eyes of the silent audience were riveted upon his motions; and then, gradually and gracefully sinking the point of his lance, he deposited the coronet which it supported at the feet of the fair Rowena. The trumpets instantly sounded, while the heralds proclaimed the Lady Rowena the Queen of Beauty and of Love for the ensuing day, menacing with suitable penalties those who should be disobedient to her authority. Then they repeated their cry of largesse, to which Cedric, in the height of his joy, replied by an ample donative, and to which Athelstane, though less promptly, added one equally large. There was some murmuring among the damsels of Norman descent, who were as much unused to see the preference given to a Saxon beauty, as the Norman nobles were to sustain defeat in the games of chivalry which they themselves had introduced. But these sounds of disaffection were drowned by the popular shout of "Long live the Lady Rowena, the chosen and lawful Queen of Love and Beauty!" to which many in the lower area added, "Long live the Saxon Princess! Long live the race of the immortal Alfred!" However unacceptable these sounds might be to Prince John and to those around him, he saw himself nevertheless obliged to confirm the nomination of the victor, and accordingly calling to horse, he left his throne and mounted his jennet. Accompanied by his train, he again entered the lists. The Prince paused a moment beneath the gallery of the Lady Alicia, to whom he paid his compliments, observing at the same time to those around him, "By my halidom, sirs, if the knight's feats in arms have shown that he hath limbs and sinews, his choice hath no less proved that his eyes are none of the clearest." It was on this occasion, as during his whole life, John's misfortune not perfectly to understand the characters of those whom he wished to conciliate. Waldemar Fitzurse was rather offended than pleased at the Prince stating thus broadly an opinion that his daughter had been slighted. "I know no right of chivalry," he said, "more precious or inalienable than that of each free knight to choose his lady love by his own judgment. My daughter courts distinction from no one, and in her own character and in her own sphere will never fail to receive the full proportion of that which is her due." Prince John replied not, but, spurring his horse as if to give vent to his vexation, he made the animal bound forward to the gallery where Rowena was seated, with the crown still at her feet. "Assume," he said, "fair lady, the mark of your sovereignty, to which none vows homage more sincerely than ourself, John of Anjou, and if it please you today, with your noble sire and friends, to grace our banquet in the castle of Ashby, we shall learn to know the Empress to whose service we devote tomorrow." Rowena remained silent, and Cedric answered for her in his native Saxon. "The Lady Rowena," he said, "possesses not the language in which to reply to your courtesy, or to sustain her part in your festival. I also, and the noble Athelstane of Coningsburgh, speak only the language and practice only the manners of our fathers. We therefore decline with thanks to your Highness's courteous invitation to the banquet. Tomorrow the Lady Rowena will take upon her the state to which she has been called by the free election of the victor knight, confirmed by the acclamations of the people." So saying, he lifted the coronet and placed it upon Rowena's head, in token of her acceptance of the temporary authority assigned to her. "What says he?" said Prince John, affecting not to understand the Saxon language, in which, however, he was well skilled. The purport of Cedric's speech was repeated to him in French. "It is well," he said. "Tomorrow we will ourselves conduct this mute sovereign to her seat of dignity. You, at least, Sir Knight," he added, turning to the victor who had remained near the gallery, "will this day share our banquet?" The knight, speaking for the first time in a low and hurried voice, excused himself by pleading fatigue, and the necessity of preparing for tomorrow's encounter. "It is well," said Prince John, haughtily. "Although unused to such refusals, we will endeavour to digest our banquet as we may, though ungraced by the most successful in arms and his elected Queen of Beauty." So saying, he prepared to leave the lists with his glittering train, and his turning his steed for that purpose was the signal for the breaking up and dispersion of the spectators. Yet, with the vindictive memory proper to offended pride, especially when combined with conscious want of desert, John had hardly proceeded 3 paces ere again, turning around, he fixed an eye of stern resentment upon the yeoman who had displeased him in the early part of the day, and issued his commands to the men-at-arms who stood near. "On your life, suffer not that fellow to escape." The yeoman stood the angry glance of the Prince with the same unvaried steadiness which had marked his former disportment, saying, with a smile, "I have no intention to leave Ashby until the day after tomorrow. I must see how Staffordshire and Leicestershire can draw their bows. The forests of Needwood and Charnwood must rear good archers." "Ay," said Prince John to his attendants, but not in direct reply, "I will see how he can draw his own, and woe betide him unless his skill should prove some apology for his insolence." "It is full time," said De Bracy, "that the outrequidance of these peasants should be restrained by some striking example." Waldemar Fitzurse, who, probably though his patron was not taking the readiest road to popularity, shrugged up his shoulders and was silent. Prince John resumed his retreat from the lists, and the dispersion of the multitude became general. In various routes, according to the different quarters from which they came, and in various groups of various numbers, the spectators were seen retiring over the plain. By far the most numerous part streamed towards the town of Ashby, where many of the distinguished persons were lodged in the castle, and where others found accommodation in the town itself. Among these were most of the knights, who had already appeared in the tournament, or who proposed to fight there the ensuing day, and who, as they rode slowly along, talking over the events of the day, were greeted with loud shouts by the populace. The same acclamations were bestowed upon Prince John, although he was indebted for them rather to the splendour of his appearance and train than the popularity of his character. A more sincere and more general, as well as a better merited acclamation, attended the victor of the day, until, anxious to withdraw himself from popular notice, he accepted the accommodation of one of those pavilions pitched at the extremities of the lists, the use of which was courteously tendered him by the marshals of the field. On his retiring to his tent, many who had lingered in the lists to look upon and form conjectures concerning him also dispersed. The signs and sounds of a tumultuous concourse of men, lately crowded together in one place, and agitated by the same passing events, were now exchanged for the distant hum of voices of different groups retreating in all directions, and these speedily died away in silence. No other sounds were heard, save the voices of the menials who stripped the galleries of their cushions and tapestry, in order to put them in safety for the night, and wrangled among themselves for the half-used bottles of wine and relics of the refreshment which had been served round to the spectators. Beyond the precincts of the lists more than one forge was erected, and these now began to glimmer through the twilight, announcing the toil of the armourers, which was to continue through the whole night, in order to repair or alter the suits of armour to be used again on the morrow. A strong guard of men-at-arms, renewed at intervals, from 2 hours to 2 hours, surrounded the lists, and kept watch during the night. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10. Thus, like the sad presaging raven that tolls the sick man's passport in her hollow beak, and in the shadow of the silent night doth shake contagion from her sable wings, vexed and tormented runs poor Barabbas, with fatal curses towards these Christians. Jew of Malta. The disinherited knight had no sooner reached his pavilion than squires and pages in abundance tendered their services to disarm him, to bring fresh attire, and to offer him the refreshment of the bath. Their zeal on this occasion was perhaps sharpened by curiosity, since every one desired to know who the knight was that had gained so many laurels, yet had refused, even at the command of Prince John, to lift his visor or to name his name. But their officious inquisitiveness was not gratified. The Disinherited Knight refused all other assistance save that of his own squire, or rather yeoman, a clownish-looking man, who, wrapped in a cloak of dark-coloured felt, and having his head and face half buried in a Norman bonnet made of black fur, seemed to affect the incognito as much as his master. All others being excluded from the tent, this attendant relieved his master from the more burdensome parts of his armour, and placed food and wine before him, which the exertions of the day rendered very acceptable. The knight had scarcely finished a hasty meal, ere his menial announced to him that 5 men, each leading a barbed steed, desired to speak with him. The Disinherited Knight had exchanged his armour for the long robe usually worn by those of his condition, which, being furnished with a hood, concealed the features, when such was the pleasure of the wearer, almost as completely as the visor of the helmet itself. But the twilight, which was now fast darkening, would of itself have rendered a disguise unnecessary, unless to persons to whom the face of an individual chanced to be particularly well known. The Disinherited Knight, therefore, stepped boldly forth to the front of his tent, and found in attendance the squires of the challengers, whom he easily knew by their russet and black dresses, each of whom led his master's charger, loaded with the armour in which he had that day fought. "According to the laws of chivalry," said the foremost of these men, "I, Baldwin de Oily, squire to the redoubted knight Brian de Bois Guilbert, make offer to you, styling yourself for the present the Disinherited Knight, of the horse and armour used by the said Brian de Bois Guilbert in this day's passage of arms, leaving it with your nobleness to retain or to ransom the same, according to your pleasure, for such is the law of arms." The other squires repeated nearly the same formula, and then stood to await the decision of the Disinherited Knight. "To you four, sirs," replied the knight, addressing those who had last spoken, "and to your honourable and valiant masters, I have one common reply. Commend me to the noble knights, your masters, and say, I should do ill to deprive them of steeds and arms which can never be used by braver cavaliers. I would I could here end my message to these gallant knights, but being, as I term myself, in truth and earnest the Disinherited, I must be thus far bound to your masters, that they will, of their courtesy, be pleased to ransom their steeds and armour, since that which I wear I can hardly term mine own." "We stand commissioned, each of us," answered the squire of Retinol-Front-Bœuf, "to offer 100 zecchins in ransom of these horses and suits of armour." "It is sufficient," said the Disinherited Knight. "Half the sum my present necessities compel me to accept. Of the remaining half, distribute 1 moiety among yourselves, sir squires, and divide the other half betwixt the heralds and the pursuivants, and minstrels and attendants." The squires, with cap in hand, and low reverences, expressed their deep sense of a courtesy and generosity not often practised, at least upon a scale so extensive. The Disinherited Knight then addressed his discourse to Baldwin, the squire of Brian de Bois Guilbert. "From your master," said he, "I will accept neither arms nor ransom. Say to him in my name, that our strife is not ended. No, not till we have fought as well with swords as with lances, as well on foot as on horseback. To this mortal quarrel he has himself defied me, and I shall not forget the challenge. Meantime, let him be assured that I hold him not as one of his companions, with whom I can with pleasure exchange courtesies, but rather as one with whom I stand upon terms of mortal defiance." "My master," answered Baldwin, "knows how to requite scorn with scorn, and blows with blows, as well as courtesy with courtesy, Since you disdain to accept from him any share of the ransom at which you have rated the arms of the other knights, I must leave his armour and his horse here, being well assured that he will never deign to mount the one, nor wear the other." "You have spoken well, good squire," said the Disinherited Knight, "well and boldly, as it beseemeth him to speak who answers for an absent master. Leave not, however, the horse and armour here. Restore them to thy master, or, if he scorns to accept them, retain them, good friend, for thine own use. So far as they are mine, I bestow them upon you freely." Baldwin made a deep obeisance, and retired with his companions, and the Disinherited Knight entered the pavilion. "Thus far, Gurth," said he, addressing his attendant, "the reputation of English chivalry hath not suffered in my hands." "And I," said Gurth, "for a Saxon swineherd, have not ill-played the personage of a Norman squire-at-arms." "Yea, but," answered the Disinherited Knight, "thou hast ever kept me in anxiety lest thy clownish bearing should discover thee." "Tush," said Gurth, "I fear discovery from no one, saving my playfellow Wamba the Jester, of whom I could never discover whether he were most knave or fool. Yet I could scarce choose but laugh, when my old master passed so near to me, dreaming all the while that Gurth was keeping his porkers many a mile off, in the thickets and swamps of Rotherwood. If I am discovered—" "Enough," said the Disinherited Knight, "thou knowest my promise." "Nay, for that matter," said Gurth, "I will never fail my friend for fear of my skin cutting. I have a tough hide, that will bear knife or scourge as well as any boar's hide in my herd." "Trust me, I will requite the risk you run for my love, Gurth," said the knight. "Meanwhile, I pray you to accept these 10 pieces of gold." "I am richer," said Gurth, putting them into his pouch, "than ever was swineherd or bondsman." "Take this bag of gold to Ashby," continued his master, "and find out Isaac the Jew of York, and let him pay himself for the horse and arms with which his credit supplied me." "Nay, by Saint Dunstan," replied Gurth, "that I will not do." "How, knave?" replied his master, "wilt thou not obey my commands?" "So they be honest, reasonable, and Christian commands," replied Gurth; "but this is none of these. To suffer the Jew to pay himself would be dishonest, for it would be cheating my master, and unreasonable, for it were the part of a fool, and unchristian, since it would be plundering a believer to enrich an infidel." "See him contented, however, thou stubborn varlet," said the Disinherited Knight. "I will do so," said Gurth, taking the bag under his cloak, and leaving the apartment. "And it will go hard," he muttered, "but I content him with 1/2 of his own asking." So saying, he departed, and left the Disinherited Knight to his own perplexed ruminations, which, upon more accounts than it is now possible to communicate to the reader, were of a nature peculiarly agitating and painful. We must now change the scene to the village of Ashby, or rather to a country house in its vicinity, belonging to a wealthy Israelite, with whom Isaac, his daughter, and retinue had taken up their quarters. The Jews, it is well known, being as liberal in exercising the duties of hospitality and charity among their own people, as they were alleged to be reluctant and churlish in extending them to those whom they termed Gentiles, and whose treatment of them certainly merited little hospitality at their hand. In an apartment, small indeed, but richly furnished with decorations of an oriental taste, Rebecca was seated on a heap of embroidered cushions, which, piled along a low platform that surrounded the chamber, served like the estrada of the Spaniards, instead of chairs or stools. She was watching the motions of her father with a look of anxious and filial affection, while he paced the apartment with a dejected mien and disordered step, sometimes clasping his hands together, sometimes casting his eyes to the roof of the apartment, as one who laboured under great mental tribulation. "Oh, Jacob!" he exclaimed, "oh, all ye 12 holy fathers of our tribe, What a losing venture is this for one who hath duly kept every jot and tittle of the law of Moses! 50 zecchins wrenched from me at one clutch, and by the talons of a tyrant!" "But, father," said Rebecca, "you seemed to give the gold to Prince John willingly." "Willingly! The blotch of Egypt upon him! Willingly, saidst thou? Ay, as willingly as when, in the Gulf of Lions, I flung over my merchandise to lighten the ship, while she laboured in the tempest; robbed the seething billows in my choice silks, perfumed their briny foam with myrrh and aloes, enriched their caverns with gold and silver work. And was not that an hour of unutterable misery, though my own hands made the sacrifice?" "But it was a sacrifice which Heaven exacted to save our lives," answered Rebecca, "and the God of our fathers has since blessed your store with your gettings." "Ay," answered Isaac, "but if the tyrant lays hold on them, as he did today, and compels me to smile while he is robbing me, oh, daughter, disinherited and wandering as we are, the worst evil which befalls our race is that when we are wronged and plundered, all the world laughs around, and we are compelled to suppress our sense of injury, and to smile tamely when we would revenge bravely." "Think not thus of it, my father," said Rebecca. "We also have advantages. These Gentiles, cruel and oppressive as they are in some sort dependent on the dispersed children of Zion, whom they despise and persecute. Without the aid of our wealth, they could neither furnish forth their hosts in war, nor their triumphs in peace. And the gold which we lend them returns with increase to our coffers. We are like the herb which flourisheth most when it is most trampled on. Even this day's pageant had not proceeded without the consent of the despised Jew who furnished the means." "Daughter," said Isaac, "thou hast harped upon another string of sorrow. The goodly steed and the rich armour, equal to the full profit of my adventure with our Kirjath Jairam of Leicester. There is a dead loss too, ay, a loss which swallows up the gains of a week, ay, of the space between 2 Sabbaths. And yet it may end better than I now think, for 'tis a good youth." "Assuredly," said Rebecca, "you shall not repent you of requiting the good deed received of the stranger knight." "I trust so, daughter," said Isaac, "and I trust too in the rebuilding of Zion. But as well do I hope with my own bodily eyes to see the walls and battlements of the new temple, as to see a Christian, yea, the very best of Christians, repay a debt to a Jew, unless under the awe of the judge and jailer." So saying, he resumed his discontented walk through the apartment, and Rebecca, perceiving that her attempts at consolation only served to awaken new subjects of complaint, wisely desisted from her unavailing efforts. A prudential line of conduct, and we recommend to all who set up for comforters and advisers to follow it in like circumstances. The evening was now becoming dark, when a Jewish servant entered the apartment, and placed upon the table 2 silver lamps fed with perfumed oil. The richest wines and the most delicate refreshments were at the same time displayed by another Israelitish domestic, on a small ebony table, inlaid with silver, for in the interior of their houses the Jews refused themselves no expensive indulgences. At the same time, the servant informed Isaac that a Nazarene, so they termed Christians while conversing among themselves, desired to speak with him. He that would live by traffic must hold himself at the disposal of every one claiming business with him. Isaac at once replaced on the table the untasted glass of Greek wine which he had just raised to his lips, and, saying hastily to his daughter, "Rebecca, veil thyself," commanded the stranger to be admitted. Just as Rebecca had dropped over her fine features a screen of silver gauze which had reached to her feet, the door opened and Gurth entered, wrapped in the ample folds of his Norman mantle. His appearance was rather suspicious than prepossessing, especially as, instead of doffing his bonnet, he pulled it still deeper over his rugged brow. "Art thou Isaac, the Jew of York?" said Gurth in Saxon. "I am," replied Isaac, in the same language, for his traffic had rendered every tongue spoken in Britain familiar to him. "And who art thou?" "That is not for the purpose," answered Gurth. "As much as my name is to thee," replied Isaac, "for without knowing thine, how can I hold intercourse with thee?" "Easily," answered Gurth. "I, being to pay money, must know that I deliver it to the right person. Thou, who art to receive it, wilt not, I think, care very greatly by whose hands it is delivered." "Oh," said the Jew, "you are come to pay moneys? Holy Father Abraham, that altereth our relation to each other. And from whom dost thou bring it?" "From the Disinherited Knight," said Gurth, "victor in this day's tournament. It is the price of the armour supplied to him by Kirjath Jairam of Leicester, on thy recommendation. The steed is restored to thy stable. I desire to know the amount of the sum which I am to pay for the armour." "I said he was a good youth," exclaimed Isaac, with joyful exultation. "A cup of wine will do thee no harm," he added, filling and handing to the swineherd a richer draught than Gurth had ever before tasted. "And how much money," continued Isaac, "hast thou brought with thee?" "Holy Virgin!" said Gurth, setting down the cup, "what nectar these unbelieving dogs drink, while true Christians are fain to quaff ale as muddy and thick as the draught we give to hogs! What money have I brought with me?" continued the Saxon, when he had finished this uncivil ejaculation. "Even but a small sum, something in hand the whilst. What, Isaac, thou must bear a conscience, though it be a Jewish one." "Nay, but," said Isaac, "thy master has won goodly steeds and rich armours with the strength of his lance and of his right hand. But 'tis a good youth. The Jew will take these in present payment, and render him back the surplus." "My master has disposed of them already," said Gurth. "Ah, that was wrong," said the Jew. "That was the part of a fool. No Christian here could buy so many horses and armour. No Jew except myself would give him half the values. But thou hast 100 zecchins with thee in that bag," said Isaac, prying under Gurth's cloak. "It is a heavy one." "I have heads for crossbow bolts in it," said Gurth readily. "Well then," said Isaac, panting and hesitating between habitual love of gain and a new-born desire to be liberal in the present instance, "if I should say that I would take 80 zecchins for the good steed and the rich armour, which leaves me not a guilder's profit, have you money to pay me?" "Barely," said Gurth, though the sum demanded was more reasonable than he expected. "And it will leave my master nigh penniless. Nevertheless, if such be your least offer, I must be content." "Fill thyself another goblet of wine," said the Jew. "Ah, 80 zecchins is too little. It leaveth no profit for the usages of the moneys. And besides, the good horse may have suffered wrong in this day's encounter. Oh, it was a hard and a dangerous meeting, man and steed rushing on each other like wild bulls of Bashan. The horse cannot but have had wrong." "And I say," replied Gurth, "he is sound, wind and limb, and you may see him now in your stable. And I say, over and above, that 70 zecchins is enough for the armour, and I hope a Christian's word is as good as a Jew's. If you will not take 70, I will carry this bag," and he shook it till the contents jingled, "back to my master." "Nay, nay," said Isaac, "lay down the talents, the shekels, the 80 zecchins, and thou shalt see I will consider thee liberally." Gurth at length complied, and telling out 80 zecchins upon the table, the Jew delivered out to him an acquittance for the horse and suit of armour. The Jew's hand trembled for joy as he wrapped up the first 70 pieces of gold. The last 10 he told over with much deliberation, pausing, and saying something as he took each piece from the table and dropped it into his purse. It seemed as if his avarice were struggling with his better nature, and compelling him to pouch zecchine after zecchine, while his generosity urged him to restore some part, at least, to his benefactor, or as a donation to his agent. His whole speech ran nearly thus: 71, 72, thy master is a good youth, 73, An excellent youth, 74. That piece hath been clipped within the ring, 75. And that looketh light of weight, 76. When thy master wants money, let him come to Isaac of York, 77. That is with reasonable security. Here he made a considerable pause, and Gurth had hope that the last three pieces might escape the fate of their comrades. But the enumeration proceeded. 78. Thou art a good fellow. 79. And deservest something for thyself. Here the Jew paused again, and looked at the last zecchin, intending doubtless to bestow it upon Gurth. He weighed it upon the tip of his finger, and made it ring by dropping it upon the table. Had it rung too flat, or had it felt a hair's breadth too light, generosity had carried the day. But, unhappily for Gurth, the chime was full and true, the zecchin plump, newly coined, and a grain above weight. Isaac could not find it in his heart to part with it, so dropped it into his purse, as if in absence of mind, with the words, 80 completes the tale, and I trust thy master will reward thee handsomely. Surely," he added, looking earnestly at the bag, "thou hast more coins in that pouch." Gurth grinned, which was his nearest approach to a laugh, as he replied, "About the same quantity which thou hast told over so carefully." He then folded the quittance, and put it under his cap, adding, "Peril of thy beard, Jew, see that this be full and ample." He filled himself, unbidden, a third goblet of wine, and left the apartment without ceremony. "Rebecca," said the Jew, "that Ishmaelite hath gone somewhat beyond me. Nevertheless, his master is a good youth. Ay, and I am well pleased that he hath gained shekels of gold and shekels of silver, even by the speed of his horse, and by the strength of his lance, which, like that of Goliath the Philistine, might vie with the weaver's beam." As he turned to receive Rebecca's answer, he observed that during his chaffering with Gurth, she had left the apartment unperceived. In the meanwhile, Gurth had descended the stair, and having reached the dark antechamber, or hall, was puzzling about to discover the entrance, when a figure in white, shown by a small silver lamp, which she held in her hand, beckoned him to a side apartment. Gurth had some reluctance to obey the summons. Rough and impetuous as a wild boar, where only earthly force was to be apprehended, he had all the characteristic terrors of a Saxon respecting fawns, forest fiends, white women, and the whole of the superstitions which his ancestors had brought with them from the wilds of Germany. He remembered, moreover, that he was in the house of a Jew, a people who, besides the other amiable qualities which popular report ascribed to them, were supposed to be profound necromancers and Kabbalists. Nevertheless, after a moment's pause, he obeyed the beckoning summons of the apparition, and followed her into the apartment which she indicated, where he found, to his joyful surprise, that his fair guide was the beautiful Jewess whom he had seen at the tournament, and a short time in her father's apartment. She asked him the particulars of his transaction with Isaac, which he detailed accurately. "My father did but jest with thee, good fellow," said Rebecca. "He owes thy master deeper kindness than these arms and steed could pay, were their value tenfold. What sum didst thou pay my father even now?" 80 zecchins, said Gurth, surprised at the question. "In this purse," said Rebecca, "thou wilt find 100. Restore to thy master that which is his due, and enrich thyself with the remainder. Haste, begone. Stay not to render thanks, and beware how you pass through this crowded town, where thou mayst easily lose both thy burden and thy life. Reuben," she added, clapping her hands together, "light forth this stranger, and fail not to draw lock and bar behind him." Reuben, a dark-browed and black-bearded Israelite, obeyed her summons with a torch in his hand, undid the outward door of the house, and conducting Gurth across a paved court, let him out through a wicket in the entrance gate, which he closed behind him with such bolts and chains as would well have become that of a prison. "By Saint Dunstan," said Gurth, as he stumbled up the dark avenue, This is no Jewess, but an angel from heaven. 10 zecchins from my brave young master, 20 from this pearl of Zion. O happy day! Such another, Gurth, will redeem thy bondage, and make thee a brother, as free of thy guild as the best. And then do I lay down my swineherd's horn and staff, and take the freeman's sword and buckler, and follow my young master to the death, without hiding either my face or my name." End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11. First Outlaw. "Stand, sir, and throw us that you have about you. If not, we'll make you sit and rifle you." Speed. "Sir, we are undone. These are the villains that all the travellers do fear so much." Val. "My friends." First Out. "That's not so, sir. We are your enemies." Second Out. "Peace, we'll hear him." Third Out. "Ay, by my beard will we, for he's a proper man." Two Gentlemen of Verona. The nocturnal adventures of Gurth were not yet concluded. Indeed, he himself became partly of that mind when, after passing one or two straggling houses which stood in the outskirts of the village, he found himself in a deep lane, running between two banks overgrown with hazel and holly, while here and there a dwarf oak flung its arms all together across the path. The lane was, moreover, much rutted and broken up by the carriages which had recently transported articles of various kinds to the tournament, and it was dark, for the banks and bushes intercepted the light of the harvest moon. From the village were heard the distant sounds of revelry, mixed occasionally with loud laughter, sometimes broken by screams, and sometimes by wild strains of distant music. All these sounds, intimating the disorderly state of the town, crowded with military nobles and their dissolute attendants, gave Gurth some uneasiness. "The Jewess was right," he said to himself. "By heaven and Saint Dunstan, I would I were safe at my journey's end with all this treasure. Here are such numbers, I will not say errant of thieves, but of errant knights and errant squires, errant monks and errant minstrels, errant jugglers and errant jesters, that a man with a single merk would be in danger, much more a poor swineherd with a whole bagful of zecchins. Would I were out of the shade of these infernal bushes, that I might at least see any of St. Nicholas's clerks before they spring on my shoulders." Gurth accordingly hastened his pace, in order to gain the open common to which the lane led, but was not so fortunate as to accomplish his object. Just as he attained the upper end of the lane, where the underwood was thickest, 4 men sprung upon him, even as his fears anticipated, 2 from each side of the road, and seized him so fast, that resistance, if at first practicable, would have been now too late. "Surrender your charge," said one of them. "We are the deliverers of the Commonwealth, who ease every man of his burden." "You should not ease me of mine so lightly," muttered Gurth, whose surly honesty could not be tamed even by the pressure of immediate violence. "Had I it but in my power to give 3 strokes in its defence." "We shall see that presently," said the robber, and, speaking to his companions, he added, "Bring along the knave. I see he would have his head broken as well as his purse cut, and so be let blood in 2 veins at once." Gurth was hurried along agreeably to this mandate, and having been dragged somewhat roughly over the bank on the left-hand side of the lane, found himself in a straggling thicket, which lay betwixt it and the open common. He was compelled to follow his rough conductors into the very depth of this cover, where they stopped unexpectedly in an irregular open space, free in a great measure from trees, and on which, therefore, the beams of the moon fell without much interruption from boughs and leaves. Here his captors were joined by 2 other persons, apparently belonging to the gang. They had short swords by their sides, and quarterstaves in their hands, and Gurth could now observe that all 6 wore visors, which rendered their occupation a matter of no question, even had their former proceedings left it in doubt. "What money hast thou, churl?" said one of the thieves. 30 zecchins of my own property," answered Gurth doggedly. "A forfeit, a forfeit," shouted the robbers. A Saxon hath 30 zecchins, and returned sober from a village? An undeniable and unredeemable forfeit of all he hath about him." "I hoarded it to purchase my freedom," said Gurth. "Thou art an ass," replied one of the thieves. 3 quarts of a double ale had rendered thee as free as thy master, ay, and freer too, if he be a Saxon like thyself." "A sad truth," replied Gurth; "but if these same 30 zecchins will buy my freedom from you, unloose my hands, and I will pay them to you." "Hold," said one who seemed to exercise some authority over the others. "This bag which thou bearest, as I can feel through thy cloak, contains more coin than thou hast told us of." "It is the good knight my master's," answered Gurth, "of which assuredly I would not have spoken a word, had you been satisfied with working your will upon mine own property." "Thou art an honest fellow," replied the robber, "I warrant thee, and we worship not Saint Nicholas so devoutly, but what thy 30 zecchins may yet escape if thou deal uprightly with us. Meantime, render up thy trust for the time." So saying, he took from Gurth's breast the large leathern pouch, in which the purse given him by Rebecca was enclosed, as well as the rest of the zecchins, and then continued his interrogation. "Who is thy master?" "The disinherited knight," said Gurth. "Whose good lance," replied the robber, "won the prize in today's tourney? What is his name and lineage?" "It is his pleasure," answered Gurth, "that they be concealed, and from me assuredly you will learn naught of them." "What is thine own name and lineage?" "To tell that," said Gurth, "might reveal my master's." "Thou art a saucy groom," said the robber; "but of that anon. How comes thy master by this gold? Is it of his inheritance, or by what means hath it accrued to him?" "By his good lance," answered Gurth. "These bags contain the ransom of 4 good horses and 4 good suits of armour." "How much is there?" demanded the robber. 200 zecchins. "Only 200 zecchins," said the bandit. "Your master hath dealt liberally by the vanquished, and put them to a cheap ransom. Name those who paid the gold." Gurth did so. "The armour and horse of the Templar Brian de Bois Guilbert. At what ransom were they held? Thou seest thou canst not deceive me." "My master," replied Gurth, "will take naught from the Templar save his life's blood. They are on terms of mortal defiance, and cannot hold courteous intercourse together." "Indeed?" repeated the robber, and paused after he had said the word. "And what wert thou now doing at Ashby with such a charge in thy custody?" "I went thither to render to Isaac the Jew of York," replied Gurth, "the price of a suit of armour with which he fitted my master for this tournament." "And how much didst thou pay to Isaac? Methinks, to judge by weight, there is still 200 zecchins in this pouch." "I paid to Isaac," said the Saxon, 80 zecchins, and he restored me 100 in lieu thereof." "How? What?" exclaimed all the robbers at once. "Darest thou trifle with us, that thou tellest such improbable lies?" "What I tell you," said Gurth, "is as true as the moon is in heaven. You will find the just sum in a silken purse within the leathern pouch, and separated from the rest of the gold." "Bethink thee, man," said the captain, "thou speakest of a Jew, of an Israelite, as unapt to restore gold as the dry sand of his desert to return the cup of water which the pilgrim spills upon them." "There is no more mercy in them," said another of the banditti, "than in an unbribed sheriff's officer." "It is, however, as I say," said Gurth. "Strike a light instantly," said the captain. "I will examine this said purse, and if it be as this fellow says, the Jew's bounty is little less miraculous than the stream which relieved his fathers in the wilderness." A light was procured accordingly, and the robber proceeded to examine the purse. The others crowded around him, and even 2 who had hold of Gurth relaxed their grasp, while they stretched their neck to see the issue of the search. Availing himself of their negligence, by a sudden exertion of strength and activity, Gurth shook himself free of their hold, and might have escaped, could he have resolved to leave his master's property behind him. But such was no part of his intention. He wrenched a quarterstaff from one of the fellows, struck down the captain, who was altogether unaware of his purpose, and had well nigh repossessed himself of the pouch and treasure. The thieves, however, were too nimble for him, and again secured both the bag and the trusty Gurth. "Knave," said the captain, getting up, "thou hast broken my head, and with other men of our sort thou wouldst fare the worse for thy insolence. But thou shalt know thy fate instantly. First, let us speak of thy master. The knight's matters must go before the squire's, according to the due order of chivalry. Stand thou fast in the meantime. If thou stir again, thou shalt have that will make thee quiet for thy life. Comrades," he then said, addressing his gang, "this purse is embroidered with Hebrew characters, and I well believe the yeoman's tale is true. The errant knight, his master, must needs pass us toll-free. He is too like ourselves for us to make booty of him, since dogs should not worry dogs where wolves and foxes are to be found in abundance." "Like us?" answered one of the gang. "I should like to hear how that is made good." "Why, thou fool," answered the captain, "is he not poor and disinherited as we are? Doth he not win his substance at the sword's point as we do? Hath he not beaten Front-Bœuf and Malvoisin even as we would beat them if we could? Is he not the enemy to life and death of Brian de Bois Guilbert, whom we have so much reason to fear? And were all this otherwise, wouldst thou have us show a worse conscience than an unbeliever, a Hebrew Jew?" "Nay, that were a shame," muttered the other fellow. "And yet, when I served in the band of stout old Gandelin, we had no such scruples of conscience. And this insolent peasant, he too, I warrant me, is to be dismissed scatheless?" "Not if thou canst scathe him," replied the captain. "Here, fellow," continued he, addressing Gurth, "canst thou use the staff, thou that startst to it so readily?" "I think," said Gurth, "thou shouldst be best able to reply to that question." "Nay, by my troth, thou gavest me a round knock," replied the captain. "Do as much for this fellow, and thou shalt pass scot-free. And if thou dost not, why, by my faith, as thou art such a sturdy knave, I think I must pay thy ransom myself. Take thy staff, miller," he added, "and keep thy head. And do you others let the fellow go, and give him a staff. There is little enough to lay on load by." The two champions, being alike armed with quarter-staves, stepped forward into the centre of the open space, in order to have the full benefit of the moonlight. The thieves in the meantime laughing and crying to their comrade, "Miller, beware thy toll-dish." The miller, on the other hand, holding his quarter-staff by the middle, and making it flourish round his head after the fashion which the French call faire le moulinet, exclaimed boastfully, "Come on, churl, an thou darest, thou shalt feel the strength of a miller's thumb." "If thou be'st a miller," answered Gurth undauntedly, making his weapon play around his head with equal dexterity, "thou art doubly a thief, and I, as a true man, bid thee defiance." So saying, the two champions closed together, and for a few minutes they displayed great equality in strength, courage, and skill, intercepting and returning the blows of their adversary with the most rapid dexterity, while, from the continued clatter of their weapons, a person at a distance might have supposed that there were at least 6 persons engaged on each side. Less obstinate, and even less dangerous combats have been described in good heroic verse. But that of Gurth and the miller must remain unsung, for want of a sacred poet to do justice to its eventful progress. Yet, though quarter-staff play be out of date, what we can in prose we will do for these bold champions. Long they fought equally, until the miller began to lose temper at finding himself so stoutly opposed, and at hearing the laughter of his companions, who, as usual in such cases, enjoyed his vexation. This was not a state of mind favourable to the noble game of quarter-staff, in which, as in ordinary cudgel-playing, the utmost coolness is requisite, and it gave Gurth, whose temper was steady, though surly, the opportunity of acquiring a decided advantage, in availing himself of which he displayed great mastery. The miller pressed furiously forward, dealing blows with either end of his weapon alternately, and striving to come to half-staff distance, while Gurth defended himself against the attack, keeping his hands about a yard asunder, and covering himself by shifting his weapon with great celerity, so as to protect his head and body. Thus did he maintain the defensive, making his eye, foot, and hand keep true time, until, observing his antagonist to lose wind, he darted the staff at his face with his left hand, and as the miller endeavoured to parry the thrust, he slid his right hand down to his left, and with the full swing of the weapon struck his opponent on the left side of the head, who instantly measured his length upon the green sward. "Well and yeomanly done!" shouted the robbers. "Fair play, and Old England for ever! The Saxon has saved both his purse and his hide, and the miller has met his match. Thou mayst go thy ways, my friend," said the captain, addressing Gurth, in special confirmation of the general voice, "and I will cause 2 of my comrades to guide thee by the best way to thy master's pavilion, and to guard thee from night-walkers that might have less tender consciences than ours. For there is many one of them upon the amble in such a night as this. Take heed, however," he added sternly. "Remember thou hast refused to tell thy name. Ask not after ours, nor endeavour to discover who or what we are, for if thou makest such an attempt, thou wilt come by worse fortune than has yet befallen thee." Gurth thanked the captain for his courtesy, and promised to attend to his recommendation. 2 of the outlaws, taking up their quarter-staves, and desiring Gurth to follow close in the rear, walked roundly forward along a by-path, which traversed the thicket and the broken ground adjacent to it. On the very verge of the thicket, 2 men spoke to his conductors, and receiving an answer in a whisper, withdrew into the wood, and suffered them to pass unmolested. This circumstance induced Gurth to believe both that the gang was strong in numbers, and that they kept regular guards around their place of rendezvous. When they arrived on the open heath, where Gurth might have had some trouble in finding his road, the thieves guided him straight forward to the top of a little eminence, whence he could see, spread beneath him in the moonlight, the palisades of the lists, the glimmering pavilions pitched at either end, with the pennons which adorned them fluttering in the moonbeam, and from which could be heard the hum of the song with which the sentinels were beguiling their night watch. Here the thieves stopped. "We go with you no farther," said they. "It were not safe that we should do so. Remember the warning you have received. Keep secret what has this night befallen you, and you will have no room to repent it. Neglect what is now told you, and the Tower of London shall not protect you against our revenge." "Good night to you, kind sirs," said Gurth. "I shall remember your orders, and trust that there is no offence in wishing you a safer and an honester trade." Thus they parted, the outlaws returning in the direction from whence they had come, and Gurth proceeding to the tent of his master, to whom, notwithstanding the injunction he had received, he communicated the whole adventures of the evening. The Disinherited Knight was filled with astonishment, no less at the generosity of Rebecca, by which, however, he resolved he would not profit, than that of the robbers, to whose profession such a quality seemed totally foreign. His course of reflections upon these singular circumstances was, however, interrupted by the necessity for taking repose, which the fatigue of the preceding day, and the propriety of refreshing himself for the morrow's encounter, rendered alike indispensable. The knight, therefore, stretched himself for repose upon a rich couch with which the tent was provided, and the faithful Gurth, extending his hardy limbs upon a bear skin, which formed a sort of carpet to the pavilion, laid himself across the opening of the tent, so that no one could enter without awakening him. Chapter 11.